Go.
Okay, great. Well, very glad to be joining you this morning, and as requested, I've put together a presentation in two parts. First, I'll provide an overview of my research with a focus on findings I feel are relevant to the work of the center, and second, I'll lay out a plan for how I would function in a one-year postdoc position at the center. So I'll jump right into an overview of my research. And my overall goal is to improve regional development practice and outcomes by shedding light on how regional institutions impact the public policy process and what policy approaches work given varied institutional contexts. So essentially, as the question on this slide suggests, I view institutions as one of the determinants of economic competitiveness. I don't see any major shortage of potential solutions to regional issues, but I see significant difficulty in translating so-called best practices to real contexts, where institutions compete for resources and the prevailing ways of doing business impact what policy is adopted and how it's implemented. So by institutions, I mean both formal organizations, such as universities, businesses, and governments, represented by the three boxes on the right-hand side of this slide, and the relationships among them. My approach focuses on understanding how the networks of relationships among public and private actors and regions both constrain what can be accomplished relative to economic development and provide access to particular sets of resources for addressing regional issues. My ultimate aim is to understand how institutions impact what regional development policy is feasible and effective in particular settings. I worked for several years as a planner at a University Public Service Center, and I have a real interest in the regional outreach and engagement roles of universities. So with that said, I see my work addressing topics related to how universities should best organize to engage with and make an impact on their region. So this book from Peter Zanton, pictured on this slide from 1981, examined the issue of how universities could effectively advise cities that were dealing with urban management problems. And I see my work organized around the idea of creating an updated version of this book focused on how land-grant institutions should engage with their regions in an environment where entrepreneurship and innovation are increasingly important for economic development, and a university role in development is increasingly expected. So in this context, my work addresses two main topics. First, what are the implications of how universities choose to organize their increasingly common roles as direct economic development actors through venues like research parks and technology transfer offices? And second, what insights should guide universities as they try to inform economic development policymakers in their regions through kind of more long-standing venues like extension agencies or even the University Public Service Center, similar to the one that I worked for. So I'm going to present findings in both these areas. The first, drawn from my dissertation research, I'll speak to the impact that universities' organization of their internal and external economic development activities has on the development of university research parks. And drawing from two collaborative projects, I speak to concepts that are understood in a very common sense fashion in economic development practice, and therefore form the basis of many policy approaches. Economic diversity and regional cooperation both apply to economic development. So I began my research on entrepreneurial universities by identifying three findings drawn from both scholarly literature and my experience working and being engaged in university life. First is that for innovation to have regional impacts, there has to be some degree of capacity for that region to accommodate it. Capacity that might take forms like existing high-tech technology firms in a region, or a culture and policies that encourage entrepreneurial behavior. The second finding is that this capacity varies significantly from region to region, whether that's based on how urban or rural a place is, or what industries have historically had a foothold in a region. Therefore, universities, who also vary from region to region, often face drastically different issues when they decide to become engaged in economic development. And the third finding is that existing research on the entrepreneurial university tends to focus on how universities have chosen to organize internally to encourage research commercialization. So what's missing is a focus on the role regional engagement plays, even though this seems to be a potentially key variable for explaining outcomes from the entrepreneurial university, since we have so much variation in the capacity of regions to accept innovation that universities might produce. So guided by with those three kind of problematic findings in mind, I decided to pursue research that would connect the internal organization of university economic development with how universities engage regionally in economic development, and ultimately how they're able to influence regional policy related to their research parks. So to accomplish this, I collected data on 80 universities with research parks to first inventory the units that universities use to practice economic development, everything from community development services and university extension to technology transfers and research parks, which are much more directly connected to kind of commercialization efforts. And second, I got a basic sense of how these units across the 80 universities relate to one another by just documenting their place in the university's organizational chart. And this cross-sectional look at university organization was then put into context through case studies of the 4 universities that I've listed on this slide. And the case studies themselves focused on 2 questions then. How does the organization of university economic development activities affect the character of a given university's regional engagement? And what factors enable universities to influence policies in ways that support the development of their research parks? I'm going to jump right to what I find to be the key takeaways from this research, really 3 sets of major findings. The first is that looking across the 80 universities in 4 case studies, there were more and less diverse universities in terms of what kinds of economic development activities and what extent they engaged in. But much of this seemed to be driven by size or heritage, such as whether a university was public or a land-grant institution. Where there did seem to be real differences was in how these units related to one another. This was first apparent from looking at organizational charts, but really came out in the case studies where it was clear that in some cases engagement-oriented units didn't cross paths with commercialization-oriented units, while in others there was close collaboration between those example units kind of on the extremes of a continuum of university economic development. So this is what I call cohesiveness. How much are these units working together on economic development at the university? And it did seem to play a role in how these universities engaged in their regions. Moving on to the second finding, the case studies seem to indicate that universities could exert leadership to influence what I'm calling regional industrial policy. And I think of regional industrial policy, particularly in this instance, as those factors that tend to make a region more or less conducive to entrepreneurship and innovation related to research parks. While I envisioned going in, universities winning tangible policy concessions like infrastructure funding, land use approvals, and agreements for tenants, the more successful units actually ended up leading initiatives and engaging the regions on efforts like venture capital investment networks, entrepreneurship clubs, broadband internet initiatives, and strategic planning efforts. So a lot less tangible than at least my idea going into the study. And regional industrial policy changed both from the direct actions of the universities and from the fact that other regional actors then took many initiatives and ran with them, thus strengthening the influence of these initiatives, well beyond what the universities could have accomplished on their own. So I want to jump to a study on economic diversity, where I led the data analysis as part of a team commissioned by the Appalachian Regional Commission to measure economic diversity across U.S. counties, and then conduct case studies of places that implemented economic diversification strategies. This project really responded to the common sense notions that make economic diversification a part of many regions' economic development strategies. That more diverse places are able to weather economic storms without crippling job losses, and places with a greater diversity of industries are more likely to experience growth in the long term. And so I'm glossing over many details here, but if asked, I'd give the classic two-handed economist answer to the questions I've listed about economic diversity here. It really depends. And our key contribution from the study was a framework for helping regions to use the concept of economic diversity to do better economic development planning. For any given place, the answers to the listed questions really depend on considering the what of what industries are in that place, how a place produces goods and services, essentially what skills do employees use in the production process, why that production is located in this place. Is it to tap natural resources, skilled human capital, or simply an accident of history? And finally, where does the place produce for? In other words, what markets create demand for this production? Are they right next door or thousands of miles away? And apart from geography, are these markets expanding or contracting? So I wanted to jump to my last research finding slide, focused on this idea of economic development cooperation, or cooperation in economic development. And there's a sense, both in scholarly and practical circles, that regional cooperation is almost always a good idea when it comes to economic development. And just as in the case of economic diversity, I really think this unquestioned devotion can translate to very little in the way of accomplishing or thinking about how to practically implement regional cooperation for economic development. I'll be even briefer on the findings for this study. As with the diversity study, the output is really a framework for the practical consideration of when and how cooperation makes sense. So a colleague and I developed this table based on an analysis of existing literature and really driven by 3 case studies on regional cooperation for economic development. And there are 2 dimensions captured by the headings, vertical and horizontal headings, that should be considered, when a region's thinking about cooperating or not, and when someone's thinking about how successful may that cooperation be. One dimension is that cooperation actually occurs on specific domains. It's not general. And some of those domains are more risky than others. You might think of them ranging from less challenging activities, like regional marketing activities, to activities where a breakdown in cooperation may be most likely, such as jointly recruiting businesses to locate in a region. And the second dimension to consider is that of organization. So cooperation is built on a given region's legacy of relationships among governments and other actors in economic development. And that heritage may impact both what topics are fair game for cooperation and how extensive and permanent those efforts will be. So I want to move on to the second part of the presentation, really focused on a general plan for how I would hope to spend a year as a postdoc at the center. And so I see the position as an opportunity to finalize much of the work I outlined in this previous slides, and then share this work in various scholarly and applied venues, and begin work on another round of research projects. For the cooperation and diversity projects, I see the opportunity to finalize and submit papers for journal review on each of these topics within a few months of my arrival at the center. I've been collaborating with my advisor Ed Vaser on both these projects, and I've taken the lead role for the diversity work in particular. We're really quite close to completing the paper on regional cooperation, and received enough feedback from a conference presentation to indicate that Economic Development Quarterly would be a suitable place to submit the paper. There's more work to do on the diversity project, primarily because the charge for that project was largely descriptive. However, we've already completed the heavy lifting of calculating several economic diversity metrics for each U.S. county. And the goal of a paper would be to update a 2009 International Regional Science Review paper on rural prosperity by Isserman, Vaser, and Warren. And it would both accommodate new data, 2010 census data, for determining prosperity, and also the data we use to conduct the diversity analysis, which will allow us to look at the role of diversity in much more detailed fashion than the first study was able to. So it would really focus on that aspect more than the more general analysis done for the first study. So in combination with the more applied work conducted for the Appalachian Regional Commission on Diversity, I see an opportunity for either a center policy brief or webinar on this topic, potentially focused on understanding the dimensions of economic diversity, what might make it good or bad for a place in the North Central region in particular. I see three types of papers developing out of my dissertation research. The first two developed from the literature review and conceptual framework components of the dissertation, although there was, I think, a good bit more original research associated with these chapters than might normally be the case, so I think they're compelling articles in their own right. The first article I see developing, it characterizes the organization of economic development activities at the 80 universities I mentioned in my study. The goal really being to identify distinct design types and draw from my case study work and supplement with strategic management literature, for example, to spell out some of the implications of these design choices that universities are making as they carry out economic development. And I think the Journal of Technology Transfer would make a good target for this piece at some point. The second article draws from the experiences of universities other than my four cases to spell out how universities have and can go about shaping regional development policy in their region. Specifically, I look at the historic regional development roles of MIT, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in New York, and Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, and how these roles interacted with their emergence as entrepreneurial universities. So they were essentially able to influence regional industrial policy and did so strategically, and that coincided with their subsequent development as what one might call entrepreneurial universities. So the attempt here is to flesh out the concept of university leadership, which finds its way into many articles on the economic development impacts of universities, while also moving particularly the planning literature beyond only thinking of universities as agents for physically redeveloping urban neighborhoods, as in the case popular case of Penn and Yale. And the third set of plan contributions I see from the dissertation is drawn directly from the four case study investigations, focused on addressing how organizational design affects the character of universities' regional interactions, how universities and other actors are able to influence regional development policy, and then how that policy in turn impacts research performance at these universities. There's a lot of work ahead of me to frame and shape and condense the case studies as needed, but I think research policy and regional studies will both make for good outlets for this work, as they've been tracking the emergence of the entrepreneurial university from their standpoints for some time, really. And so I see these efforts taking up the largest chunk of my time in the coming year. Fortunately, I think land-grant universities, and particularly outreach-oriented scholars and professionals at these universities, will be interested in the findings. So I would view my time at the center as a good opportunity for me to distill lessons from the organizational design and case study components of the research to develop and deliver a center webinar on the topic at some point. I'd also like to carve out part of this next year to begin work, at least preliminary work, on some new research projects. In particular, I think working at the center would provide a good home to continue my work on the entrepreneurial university. Two ideas really emerged from my work this past year. First, I think it's worth exploring what can be learned about university research parks and university economic development more generally by looking at the tenets that call those parks home. In many cases, I found that park tenants tended to be a much more eclectic mix than suggested by the popular notion of high-tech firms with close connections to university research. Examining research parks at universities in the North Central region may help to identify whether particular types of parks and related development strategies emerge before I would undertake a kind of a broader nationwide study. And the second item I see is to document how universities are approaching entrepreneurship, both as a subject to be taught formally and as part of regional engagement strategies. And there's an inventory function here to be sure. We don't really know much more than that these units and approaches are spreading across universities. But I also think there's a story to be understood here that, again, expands notions of the entrepreneurial university's impacts on regional development beyond that of high-tech innovator and all-around economic engine. And again, being at the center, I'd hope to conduct some preliminary data collection focused first on the region's universities. And time permitting, and perhaps only if it seems to really well align with center interests, I'd like to pursue 2 follow-up projects on the diversity front. First, so much of economic diversity policy is really predicated on the idea of diversity mitigating risk, but what emerged from the study is that simple measures of diversity are not really a good indicator of risk on their own. So using the calculated diversity metrics supplemented by other quantitative and qualitative data sources, I'd like to model some potential techniques that regions could use to better understand economic risk. And a second follow-on project would examine the roles that existing economic diversity plays in shaping regional responses to natural resource booms, with natural gas-driven growth being the likely suspect here. I see potential for understanding existing firms' roles in shaping a region's industrial policy. We might expect for responses to be slanted more severely than in the case in places where there's low diversity than they would be in the case where there's a large diversity of industries, types of firms. In any case, I expect that examining the role of economic diversity as an institutional force behind shaping regional development would be a worthwhile way to broaden notions of diversity beyond relatively simplistic growth and stability perspectives. So I've not listed all my planned activities on this slide, but you'll see the general idea of getting what I see as some quicker win papers out of the way early on during my tenure, delivering policy briefs and webinars in the intermediate stages, and then wrapping up with my major dissertation papers based on case study work near the end of the tenure. And not necessarily by design, but just where these fall on the calendar. My last few months I'd see presenting papers and attending relevant conferences, including, if it makes sense, APLU's Commission on Innovation, Competitiveness, and Economic Prosperity that you had mentioned when we last spoke. And speaking to my location, I'd also like to hopefully become involved in the Mid-Continent Regional Science Conference and present at that, and at least attend a regional studies conference that's being organized for June 2015 in Chicago. So that gives you a sense of the topics and general timeline that I would have in mind. And really, I'd just like to close with thank you for giving me the time to share some details on my research and plan for a potential postdoc position. And I look forward to any questions or comments. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Troy. It's a very good overview of some of your work to date and also thinking ahead,
Sure.
which is good. I like the way you laid all that out. On the economic diversity paper, could you say a little bit why you used a Probit estimator on that one?
Well, we haven't begun that part of the analysis, I should say. Okay. Probit is what was used in the original paper to look at differences between prosperous and non-prosperous places, and it was a simple binary relationship. So that was the reason that Probit was used in that instance, to look at the differences across those types of counties. So I wouldn't necessarily be wedded to that, but.
And so why was it selected as binary? Because it seems like it wouldn't be especially binary.
Yeah, it's actually another potential innovation in that project could be the idea that really it's 4 different measures that make up the prosperity scale. And so prosperous places were called places that had all 4 conditions better than the national average, and then they were called a 0 and a 1. So it may be worth examining whether there's differences along each of the 4 dimensions of prosperity, rather than putting them as 0 and 1. But the first paper was kind of exploratory on that topic, so I really think there's a lot of room to, um,
Okay.
address diversity in this case in more detail, but also, again, as I said, update prosperity in some way.
On the work that you've done on kind of university roles in economic development, and you're sort of focusing your efforts on, and of course you have to, if you're doing a dissertation, you can't do everything.
Sure.
On the industrial parks and kind of how those are organized. At least that's what I'm getting as kind of the impression.
Right.
Which is, a valid thing to be studying. But I did wonder if you had taken a look at all at how universities vary in terms of the ways they try to incentivize faculty to engage in a commercialization of their research products.
Sure. I'll say first that yes, I looked at research parks in particular. But it was really a study of how universities comprehensively organize to be engaged in economic development. And so most of my interviews, most of my documentation, let's say, was not collected on the research park necessarily, but collected by talking to people who might be in an office of economic development or extension services, things like that, to understand their role in economic development and how they might relate to the research park. So it's a little broader than just focused on research park, but I wanted to see how that might tangibly impact research park development. And so I didn't expressly look at how universities are incentivizing faculty work on entrepreneurship or their faculty involvement, but it certainly came up, particularly at West Virginia University. That was a topic that was raised. The direct quote was essentially that our faculty has not historically been very entrepreneurial. And so they were undertaking some measures. For example, they had received grant funding to make better connections between faculty researchers and industries that might be potentially interested in that research. So it wasn't an express focus, but it came out as an issue, particularly again in West Virginia and perhaps a little bit in Southern Illinois, that universities were working to address. So I'd certainly be interested in that as part of kind of a comprehensive look at what's going on the topic.
Yeah, well, it seems like there might be several factors that would kind of come together around that. I mean, there's certainly the things that the minions in the Economic Development Office can do, that what their activities are, whether they're trying to, look for prospects or help with patents or things like that. So that's fine. But it seems like there might be sort of broader institutional policies that maybe fall outside the realm of that office and certainly outside the realm of the Extension Service.
Sure.
For example, who owns the patent?
Right.
If a patent is issued, who owns it? And how are royalties thought to be split?
Sure.
Across the faculty member and the Economic Development Office, and more or going into a general fund. And there probably is also some element of overall compensation that might come into play too.
Sure.
If you're, and I don't know exactly what the relationship might be. You're talking about West Virginia. Well, they're frequently talking about being underpaid there.
Okay.
Where faculty salaries are sort of lower than their peer group.
Okay.
And then the university responds that, well, that's true, but you're forgetting that this is a high amenity place. You've got the mountains, you've got the rivers, and so, well, if you're gonna be recruiting based on the fact that you're a high amenity place, then you're probably going to get people that don't want to spend a lot of time in the lab.
Right.
Right.
Sure.
You know, they're going to go out and enjoy the high amenity
Right.
situation that they're in. So then that might play into differences in terms of how much time they want to spend, commercializing their widget that they invented.
Right.
So that might be another thing.
Sure.
Then there's also, I'm not sure how broadly the policy was applied, but after I left West Virginia, there was at least one college that decided to provide faculty bonuses for grants.
Okay.
So if a faculty member wrote a grant and it paid part of their salary, they would literally write the person a check
Okay.
for at the end of the year. So if I'm getting a check for writing a grant, then maybe I don't need to bother commercializing it, or
Right.
if I'm not getting any royalties off of the patent,
Sure.
or if I only get royalties if it's a huge hit. If it's
Right.
something that translates into $30 million, then I get royalties. But if it's something smaller, then I don't get royalties. So, I just wondered if you'd looked at those sorts of questions.
Um, yeah, again, the answer would be not directly, but I think the big value of this research and taking a comprehensive look at how universities organize relative to economic development was that they all came up, and they're all, many of them probably would be worthy kind of follow-on projects. Certainly the incentivizing issue came up in West Virginia. Patenting issue and who owns came up at Virginia Tech in particular, in terms of them moving to an open access model and them following Penn State, who was doing the same thing. So yeah, I think all those topics came up in some fashion, and it's a matter of sorting through what's kind of the most viable, not just in my head, but based on issues out there, and maybe being at the center, being engaged with university leaders, I think would be a good place to be in terms of sorting through what makes sense in terms of next steps with that research.
So what's the open access model? What is that?
Well, I don't know a lot about it, and I've done a little bit of work to try to figure that out. But essentially, that they prize partnerships with industry and industry research relationships more than they prize who actually owns the patents and intellectual property at the end of the day. That they see there's more, basically crassly kind of long-term funding to be had from maintaining partnerships than there is from banking on blockbuster patents and commercialized products coming out of those relationships. So that's the general idea.
Well, that's probably right. In terms of the industry, for sure. But maybe it's okay. Maybe you don't need to incentivize the faculty member as long as the faculty member is incentivized by the industry money coming into his or her lab. Maybe that's all right.
And I'm sure it's a little more nuanced. I'm sure it's a little more nuanced, but still, that's the general idea.
Yeah. Well, it's some of these relationships do take some time to build, and then once you've got them, they're very effective. So.
I mean, I think part of it is a reaction, or I see it as a reaction to technology transfer offices being, legal offices essentially at universities for a long time standing, and not really focused on partnerships necessarily, or ideal for that. They are good at executing detailed agreements, and that may not always be the best model for building long-term partnerships. And so I think that's kind of where I see open access as a term. How that falls out in the details, I'm not quite sure, but that's where I see open access kind of responding to there's more to be had if we build a long-standing partnership than than being as concerned as we have been about ownership issues.
Yeah, I think, well, we've been approaching it more from the faculty level here, um, kind of engaging faculty that are doing bench science, and kind of getting to know them a little bit. And it does seem that most of them tend to view the tech transfer office on campus as the enemy
Mm.
rather than as a helper.
Okay. Yeah.
So it sort of reinforces what you're saying there in terms of they're just legalistic entities,
In many cases,
not
yeah.
not viewed as particularly helpful to the faculty member in meeting his or her objectives. So,
Right.
well, very interesting. Yeah, this is a great overview. It helps me get a better sense of the kinds of things you're wanting to do with us here. Do you have any
Okay.
questions for me right now?
Uh, Other than your timing and general process moving forward, I think I'm pretty set.